Have you ever had absolute certainty of something, and then discovered that it had never existed? I'm not talking about a simple doubt or a forgotten detail. I'm talking about that strange feeling of total conviction, as if your mind has closed the matter, and yet reality simply doesn't confirm any of it. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. At some point in life, we've all been tricked by our own brains. A memory that seemed too real. A connection between two events that made perfect sense in our heads. A sign, a pattern, a coincidence that seemed impossible to be mere chance. And even when someone questions it, something inside you insists, "No, this is real, I know what I saw." Have you ever experienced this? What's most unsettling is realizing that often, there's nothing wrong with you, that it's not a lack of intelligence, it's not distraction, it's not an overactive imagination. It's the normal functioning of the human brain. A brain that was shaped to interpret the world quickly, fill in gaps, create connections, and transform fragments of information into a coherent story, even when that story doesn't correspond to reality. The human brain hates emptiness. It doesn't cope well with "I don't know," with randomness, with incompleteness. Faced with scattered information, it does what it does best: connect the dots. It creates relationships between events, associates causes and effects, builds invisible patterns. And it does this so well that often, these non-existent connections begin to seem obvious, natural, indisputable. Perhaps you've thought of someone and minutes later that person appeared or sent a message. Or you've noticed that whenever something specific happens, something else bad follows soon after. Or you've even had the feeling that certain events in your life can't be a coincidence. The brain loves this kind of narrative. It transforms chance into meaning, randomness into intention, noise into a message. And the more sense it makes emotionally, the harder it becomes to question. The curious thing is that these false connections don't arise from nothing. They are born from real experiences, intense emotions, fragmented memories, and the brain's deep need to predict the future. From a very early age, our minds learn that anticipating patterns can mean survival. It's better to err trying to find a pattern than to not react to a threat. The problem is that this same mechanism, so useful in the past, continues to operate today, even when there is no danger at all. And that's where things get really interesting. Because when the brain creates non-existent connections, it's not just misinterpreting the world. It's constructing their subjective reality. It influences your decisions, your fears, your beliefs, and even how you see yourself. Without realizing it, you may be living by reacting to patterns that never truly existed. While you watch this video, your brain continues working behind the scenes, trying to anticipate what comes next, connecting ideas, creating expectations. And maybe, just maybe, some of these connections aren't real either. Stay with me until the end, because understanding why the brain does this, and how it tricks you without you realizing it, is the first step to seeing these mechanisms in a completely different way. What comes next will take you even deeper into this mystery. And that's precisely why this conversation isn't just theoretical or distant. It touches on something very personal, very intimate. Because, at some level, we've all been guided by connections that the brain created without asking permission. Internal stories that seemed solid, decisions made based on patterns that were never truly confirmed, feelings born from automatic interpretations. If while you're listening to this, some situation from your own life starts to surface, pay attention to it. That kind of perception is already an important sign. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below sharing what has resonated with you the most so far. It could be a strange experience, a coincidence that has always intrigued you, or even that unsettling feeling of, "How could I have been so sure of that?" When you share, you're not just talking to me, you're helping other people who will read and think, "This also happens to me." This is how this exchange gains momentum. And if at any point you thought, "This is interesting, this made me reflect," or even "This gave me a little shock," consider liking the video. It may seem simple, but this gesture signals that this type of content needs to continue to exist. It's what allows more people to find this and enter into the same reflection you're experiencing now. Subscribing to the channel is also a way of saying, "I want to continue exploring these mysteries." The idea here is not to provide ready-made answers, but to provoke better questions, open spaces for awareness, and look at the human brain with more curiosity and fewer absolute certainties. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. People who may also be trying to understand why their own minds sometimes seem to create parallel realities. And while you reflect on all this, it's worth remembering, the brain is still doing what it's always done, connecting information, anticipating meanings, trying to understand where this story is going. It's just that now perhaps you're a little more attentive to this process. And it's precisely from there that things start to get even more interesting. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what lies behind these non-existent connections goes far beyond a simple trick of the mind. There is something almost invisible happening behind the scenes of your thinking, something that influences your mindset, shapes your decisions, and silently defines how you interpret the world. When I say that something strange is happening in your mind, it's not a figure of speech. It's literal. The brain doesn't function like a camera that neutrally records reality. It works much more like an editor. It selects, cuts, joins, fills in gaps, and creates a continuous narrative so that everything seems to make sense. This narrative doesn't prioritize absolute truth, but rather internal coherence. The brain wants stability, predictability, a sense of control. And to achieve this, it creates connections, even when they don't actually exist. Perhaps you've never stopped to think about it this way, but a large part of your personal journey is guided by automatic interpretations. Small events take on enormous significance. Isolated experiences become internal rules. A decision made in the past becomes a pattern you repeat without realizing it. All this happens because the brain prefers a consistent story to a scenario full of gaps. Emptiness is unsettling. Uncertainty weighs heavily. And it is in this space that invisible connections are born. What's most fascinating is that this mechanism isn't a flaw. It's a profound adaptation. Throughout evolution, quickly identifying patterns meant survival. Associating sounds, shadows, or movements with potential threats saved lives. The brain learned that it was better to assume a connection and be wrong than to assume nothing and be caught off guard. This ancestral logic still operates today, even in completely different contexts, where the danger is no longer physical but emotional, social, and psychological. That's why certain ideas seem so true even without proof. That's why some beliefs take root so strongly. The brain isn't seeking the hidden truth of the facts, but a sense of inner security. It wants to reduce chaos, organize experience, transform the unpredictable into something comprehensible. And, in this process, it constructs internal realities that may or may not correspond to what is actually happening. When you realize this, something begins to change. Not abruptly but subtly. You start to notice that many certainties are, in fact, mental shortcuts. That some convictions were born more from repetition than from reflection. That certain emotions arise because the brain connected dots that were never verified. This perception is powerful because it opens up space for transformation. Not a forced transformation but a change of perspective. This is where science and self-knowledge meet. Understanding how the brain creates non-existent connections is not just an intellectual exercise. It's a practical tool for dealing with one's own mind. It's realizing that thoughts are not facts. That feelings of certainty don't guarantee truth. That many decisions are made behind the scenes without you realizing the script is being written. And this has a real impact. An impact on how you react to people. On how you interpret ambiguous situations. On how quickly you judge, trust, or distrust. When the brain finds a familiar pattern, it relaxes. When something deviates from that pattern, it tenses. All of this happens even before you formulate a conscious thought. It's automatic, silent, efficient, and, at the same time, profoundly deceptive at certain moments. Perhaps the most intriguing thing of all is realizing that these false connections don't present themselves as doubt. They present themselves as clarity. As that inner feeling of, it all makes sense. And that's precisely where the danger lies. The more comfortable the explanation, the less the brain feels the need to question. The more coherent the narrative, the less room there is for contradiction. The mind closes the circuit and moves on. But when you begin to observe this process, something shifts. You don't stop making connections, that's inevitable. But you start to recognize them as hypotheses, not as absolute truths. You begin to see your own interpretations as temporary constructs, not as final reality. This simple adjustment in mental posture completely changes the relationship you have with your thoughts. And it's not about living in constant doubt or losing the ability to decide. On the contrary, it's about developing a more refined awareness of how your certainties are formed. About understanding that, often, the brain is just trying to protect you from the discomfort of the unknown. When you realize this, you gain more inner freedom. Freedom to question, to revise, to choose more clearly. As this reflection deepens, it's important to note that the brain continues to operate in the same way. It still connects ideas, associates events, and creates meaning. The difference is that now there is a small space for observation. An interval between the stimulus and the interpretation. And it is precisely in this interval that the most interesting revelations about how the mind works begin. Because, from this point on, we're no longer just talking about isolated non-existent connections, but about how this mechanism influences memories, beliefs, identity, and even the way you construct your own story. It's at this point that things get really deep, and it's into this territory that the conversation naturally begins to move. Before moving on, if any part of this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the role of the brain completely changes how you view your own thoughts. There's a widespread idea that the brain is a kind of truth seeker, almost an impartial judge analyzing facts and arriving at the best possible conclusions. But that's a comfortable illusion. In practice, the brain's main mission has never been to find the truth. Its mission has always been to create meaning. The brain is a machine that hates emptiness. It doesn't tolerate gaps, silences, or incomplete information well. When something doesn't fit, when an explanation is missing, when the data doesn't add up, an internal discomfort arises that is difficult to ignore. This discomfort is not just psychological, it's almost physical. And it is precisely to relieve this tension that the brain kicks in, connecting the dots, filling in the gaps, and creating a narrative that restores a sense of coherence. This explains why the brain prefers a false explanation to absolute silence. "I don't know," leaves everything open-ended, generates instability, and threatens the feeling of control. An explanation, even a mistaken one, organizes the experience, creates predictability, and calms the system. The brain doesn't ask if the story is true. It asks if the story makes enough sense to move forward. This mechanism operates all the time behind the scenes of the mind without asking permission. When you don't understand a behavior, the brain invents an intention. When an event happens without apparent cause, it creates a connection. When something deviates from the expected pattern, it adjusts the interpretation so that the world continues to seem comprehensible. All of this happens automatically, quickly, and silently. It's important to understand that this is not a sign of mental weakness. On the contrary, it's an extremely efficient system from an evolutionary standpoint. A brain that waits for absolute proof before acting doesn't survive in unpredictable environments. A brain that makes sense quickly, even with little information, reacts faster, decides faster, and protects itself faster. The cost of this is the occasional distortion of reality. The benefit is survival. Throughout life, this pattern becomes refined. Past experiences fuel future expectations. Intense emotions reinforce certain connections. Repetitions create mental shortcuts. Gradually, the brain builds an internal map of the world and begins to interpret everything from that map. The problem is that maps are not the territory. They are merely simplified representations, full of omissions and adjustments. When the brain encounters a void, missing information, an inconsistency, a doubt, it resorts to this internal map. It cross-references, activates memories, accesses beliefs, and produces an answer that seems plausible. And the faster this answer emerges, the more truthful it seems. Speed creates the illusion of certainty. That's why many decisions are made without conscious reflection. Not because you don't think, but because the brain has already delivered a ready-made interpretation before you even realize there was a question. This is a crucial point in the journey of self-knowledge. Realizing that a large part of your mental life happens before consciousness enters the scene. This dynamic has a direct impact on the mindset with which you face challenges, changes, and uncertainties. Faced with the unknown, the brain doesn't relax. It works even harder. It seeks familiar patterns, tries to fit the new into the old, and creates temporary explanations to reduce anxiety. These explanations aren't always correct, but they are almost always comforting. There is something profoundly human in this process. The brain wants to protect you from chaos. It wants to prevent reality from seeming too random, illogical, unstructured. It constructs meaning like someone building a shelter. Sometimes this shelter is solid. Other times it is fragile. But as long as it stands, the brain feels it has done its job. The turning point happens when you begin to observe this mechanism in action. Not to fight it, but to understand it. When a certainty arises too quickly, an explanation that is too comfortable, a conclusion that easily closes all questions, it is worth pausing internally. Not to deny it, but to recognize. This is a construct, not necessarily the hidden truth. This recognition changes the impact of your own interpretations. You begin to deal with thoughts as hypotheses, not as final judgments. You begin to realize that many beliefs were born from a need for meaning, not from solid evidence. And this opens up space for more conscious choices, less automatic decisions, and a more honest relationship with your own mind. The brain continues to hate emptiness. That doesn't change. But you start to create an internal space where emptiness doesn't need to be immediately filled. A space where doubt can exist for a few moments without generating panic. Where "I still don't know" ceases to be a threat and becomes a possibility. It is in this space that the deepest revelations begin. Because when the brain is not forced to quickly close the story, other layers appear. Hidden emotions, distorted memories, old patterns that continue to operate without revision. That's when you begin to see not only what you think but why you think the way you think. And the more you observe, the clearer it becomes that this meaning-making mechanism is present in practically everything. In relationships, in career choices, in interpretations of oneself, in the narratives you tell about your own past. None of this arises from nothing. Everything is organized by this brain that prefers an imperfect explanation to absolute silence. This understanding doesn't provide definitive answers. It brings something more valuable, awareness. An awareness that doesn't eliminate the workings of the brain, but illuminates its inner workings. And from here, the gaze naturally begins to turn to concrete examples of how this mechanism appears in everyday life, subtly and often invisibly. If this reflection sparked something in you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because up to this point we've talked why the brain creates meaning, but we haven't entered the how does this happen in practice. In everyday life, far from abstract theories, things start to become clearer, and at the same time more uncomfortable. Because when you understand what's really happening, you realize that these non-existent connections are neither rare nor exceptions. They are part of the mental routine of practically everyone. When we say that the brain creates non-existent connections, we're talking about something very specific. It links events that have no real relation to each other, creates patterns where there are none, and associates cause and effect without any concrete proof. The most important detail is that this doesn't happen consciously. You don't decide to make this connection. It simply arises ready-made, convincing, and complete. Imagine a simple situation. You're having a bad day at work. Nothing catastrophic, just minor setbacks. Later, someone close to you replies to a message curtly. Your brain immediately kicks in. It connects the dots. Things are going wrong today. People are acting strangely towards me. In a few seconds, an entire narrative is constructed. There's no real evidence that one thing caused the other, but the meaning has already been created. And once created, it begins to influence your mood, your decisions, and your attitude from then on. This is a classic example of how the brain creates patterns where there are none. It takes isolated events and transforms them into a logical sequence. The problem is that this logic is internal, not factual. It exists only within your subjective experience. And yet, it is felt as truth. Another everyday example. You think about someone you haven't spoken to in a long time, and shortly after, that person shows up or sends a message. The brain reacts almost instantly. This can't be a coincidence. There's something going on. Even knowing, rationally, that thoughts arise all the time and that random encounters happen, the mind prefers the most interesting story. It associates cause and effect without proof because this generates emotional impact, mystery, a feeling of connection to something greater. These non-existent connections also appear in decisions. Someone makes an important choice and something goes wrong soon after. The brain registers it. The next time a similar decision arises, it retrieves that memory and creates a rule. When I do this, something bad happens. It doesn't matter how many variables were involved in that original situation. The pattern has already been created. The hidden truth ceases to be investigated because the brain feels it has already understood enough. This is how beliefs are formed. Not through rigorous logic but through rapid associations. Emotional repetition. Subjective impact. The brain doesn't need much evidence. It needs coherence. If the internal story holds up, it moves forward. The most curious thing is that the simpler the connection, the more convincing it seems. Short sentences, quick conclusions, direct explanations. The brain likes that. It doesn't like ambiguity. It doesn't like open-ended stories. It prefers to close the account, even if the result is wrong. Silence, doubt, the absence of an answer require energy. Creating an explanation, any explanation, saves effort. Behind the scenes, what's happening is almost a game of mental survival. The brain is constantly evaluating the environment and asking, is this safe? Does this make sense? Can I predict what comes next? When it doesn't find clear answers, it fabricates one. And this fabrication doesn't come with a warning saying, attention, this is just a hypothesis. It comes packaged as certainty. This mechanism has a profound impact on mindset. It influences how you interpret social cues, how you react to criticism, and how you assess opportunities and risks. Often, you believe you are making rational decisions when in reality you are merely obeying old connections that have never been reviewed. Think about how many times you've avoided something because it always goes wrong. or trusted someone because you had a good feeling right away, or been suspicious of a situation without knowing why. These feelings don't arise from nothing. They are constructs, connections created by the brain from fragments of experiences, emotions, and incomplete memories. The brain is extremely good at creating shortcuts. These shortcuts speed up life, but they also distort perception. They function like invisible filters. You don't see the world as it is, but as it appears to be after passing through these filters. And the older and more repeated they are, the harder they become to perceive. There's something almost paradoxical about all this. The non-existent connections give the brain a sense of control over reality, but at the same time reduce inner freedom. Because when you blindly believe in these patterns, you start to react automatically. The journey ceases to be exploratory and becomes repetitive. The point is not to eliminate this mechanism. That would be impossible. The point is to make it visible. When you understand that the brain connects unrelated events, creates artificial patterns, and associates cause and effect without proof, something changes in how you relate to your own thoughts. You begin to observe before accepting, to question before concluding, to sustain discomfort for a few more seconds. This brief pause changes everything. It opens up space for transformation, for more conscious choices, for decisions less guided by automatic narratives. And little by little, you begin to realize how many internal stories were operating invisibly, shaping your reality without you even noticing. And the more attention you pay to this, the clearer it becomes that these connections don't just affect isolated situations. They infiltrate how you construct your identity, interpret the past, and imagine the future. They organize your personal history in ways that seem natural, but aren't always true. It is precisely from this point that the gaze begins to delve even deeper, because understanding the mechanism is only the beginning. From here, even clearer examples emerge, common experiences that almost no one questions, but which reveal a great deal about how the mind really works. If this part of the reflection resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where theory meets real life. This is where everything ceases to be just an interesting concept about the brain and begins to touch on experiences you have already lived, felt, and perhaps never stopped to question. This is the moment when the mind closes the circuit. And when that happens, the feeling of certainty is usually so strong that any doubt seems unnecessary. Consider that classic situation. You're going about your routine, perhaps distracted, perhaps remembering someone you haven't seen in a long time. The thought pops into your head. A face, a name, a fleeting memory. Shortly after, the phone rings. It's that person. The impact is immediate. A small internal shock. The brain doesn't waste time analyzing probabilities, frequency of thoughts, or basic statistics. It connects the dots instantly. It wasn't a coincidence. There was something in the air. I felt it. In that instant, the circuit closes. The meaning is created. The explanation seems too obvious to ignore. The interesting thing is to realize that thoughts about people constantly arise all the time. Most don't result in any connection. But those don't attract attention. They go unnoticed. However, when the event coincides, it gains emotional prominence. It is registered, reinforced, stored. And little by little, it becomes internal proof that there is a special connection there. The brain doesn't lie maliciously. It simply selects what seems most significant. Another common example appears when someone begins to notice a negative pattern. Whenever this happens, something bad comes next. It could be an object, a date, a specific decision. The brain observes 2 or 3 similar occurrences and builds a rule. From then on, every time the first event arises, the body reacts. Tension, expectation, anxiety. The mind prepares for the worst. Even if dozens of times nothing has happened, the brain focuses on the few confirmations and ignores the rest. The circuit is closed. The narrative is ready. These associations have a silent impact on decisions. Someone might refrain from doing something because they already know how it ends. They might avoid an opportunity because every time they tried it went wrong. They might overtrust an external signal because it never fails. The brain loves these quick conclusions. They reduce mental effort, eliminate the discomfort of doubt, and create a sense of control. Even if that control is illusory. There's also that moment when something small takes on enormous significance. A gesture, a word, a look. That sign can only mean one thing. The brain takes an isolated detail and builds an entire story around it. Intention, motivation, consequence. Everything emerges automatically. The hidden truth of the situation, the real context, the invisible variables, the alternative interpretations, isn't even considered. The meaning has already been created. These examples are so common that almost no one questions them. They are part of the human experience. And that's precisely why they generate such a strong emotional peak. Because when you hear about these situations, you recognize yourself. You remember something similar. Maybe more than one thing. Maybe several. And in this recognition, a strange mixture of comfort and unease arises. Comfort at not being alone. Unease at realizing how convincing the mind can be even when it's just creating stories. Behind the scenes, a simple yet powerful mechanism is at play. The brain seeks closure. It wants to conclude. It wants to connect the beginning, middle, and end. Open-ended stories are unsettling. Pure coincidences seem too empty. The brain prefers to believe there's an invisible thread connecting events. This gives meaning to the journey. It gives coherence to the experience. It gives the feeling that the world isn't too chaotic. The problem isn't in creating meaning. The problem arises when that meaning begins to be treated as an absolute fact. When the internally created connection starts to govern emotions, choices, and behaviors without being reviewed. From then on, the mind goes into automatic mode. It reacts before reflecting. It decides before observing. It repeats before questioning. These non-existent connections also shape how you interpret the past. Isolated events are rearranged to form a coherent narrative. It's always been like this. It was obvious from the beginning. The brain rewrites history so that everything seems predictable. This reconstruction doesn't happen out of malice. It happens because the brain needs the story to make sense now, in the present. Factual truth matters less than emotional coherence. And the more an internal narrative is repeated, the more solid it becomes. It becomes part of your identity, your mindset, the way you define yourself and present yourself to the world. Questioning it starts to seem dangerous. After all, if that connection isn't real, what's left? Emptiness. And the brain hates emptiness. But it is precisely at this point that something begins to change. When you realize that many of these certainties were born from closed circuits quickly, without deep investigation. When you understand that emotional impact does not guarantee truth. When you recognize that a feeling of meaning is not proof of real connection. This perception doesn't eliminate the emotions involved. But it creates a different internal space. A space where you can observe your own thoughts unfolding. Where you can feel certainty arising, and yet not completely merge with it. This slight shift changes the quality of the experience. The journey ceases to be entirely automatic. And the more you observe these examples in your daily life, the more you begin to notice recurring patterns. Situations where the mind closed the loop too early. Stories that seemed obvious but were never verified. Decisions made to avoid discomfort, not to seek clarity. These revelations don't all come at once. They appear gradually as your gaze deepens. This is where the conversation begins to touch on even more sensitive layers, because these connections don't just affect coincidences or small events. They influence relationships, important choices, and how you interpret yourself. That's where the impact becomes truly profound, and the path naturally leads to understanding why the brain does this so efficiently, and what the long-term consequences are. If any of these situations sounded familiar, comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we understand because this mechanism exists, and everything starts to make sense differently. Not a magical or comfortable sense, but an honest sense. The truth is that the brain wasn't designed to function well in a modern world full of abstractions, probabilities, and statistics. It was designed to keep you alive. And that changes everything. For most of human history, the environment was unpredictable, hostile, and dangerous. There was no time for careful analysis, nor room for prolonged doubt. A noise in the bushes could just be the wind, or it could be a predator. Waiting for proof meant death. In this context, detecting patterns quickly wasn't just useful, it was essential. The brain learned that it was better to assume there was a threat than to risk ignoring it. That's where this profound mechanism for creating connections is born. The brain has begun to function as an early warning system. It observes fragments, incomplete signals, small repetitions, and constructs an interpretation even before having all the information. Logic doesn't come first. Survival comes first. Logic enters later if it enters at all. To err on the side of caution was safer than not reacting at all. If the brain connected events that had no real relation, the cost was low. A scare, an unnecessary escape, an extra expenditure of energy. But if it failed to connect signals that truly indicated danger, the cost was maximum. This imbalance profoundly shaped how the human mind operates to this day. Even now, in a world where we rarely need to flee from predators, the brain continues to use the same software. It treats uncertainties as potential threats. It doesn't like to wait. It doesn't like silence. It prefers to act on an imperfect hypothesis rather than stand still without an answer. Therefore, the brain prefers to be wrong than to be unprepared. This principle directly influences the mindset with which you face new situations. When faced with the unknown, the brain enters defensive mode. It searches for familiar patterns, recalls past experiences, activates emotional memories, and creates a quick narrative to guide action. It doesn't matter if this narrative is factually true. What matters is whether it allows you to react. That's why certain decisions seem to arise out of nowhere. A feeling of alert, an immediate distrust, an impulse to avoid something. These reactions are not random. They are products of a system trained to anticipate risks with incomplete information. The brain doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Could this be dangerous?" If the answer is maybe, it already acts. Behind the scenes, this creates a curious effect. The brain begins to treat imagined patterns as if they were real. An isolated negative experience becomes a permanent warning. A one-off mistake becomes the norm. A significant event gains disproportionate weight. All this because, from an evolutionary point of view, generalizing was safer than analyzing each case individually. This ancestral logic still profoundly impacts the emotional world. Fears persist even without a real threat. Anxieties arise without a concrete cause. Intense reactions appear in situations that, rationally, would not justify such an emotional charge. The brain is not trying to interfere. It is trying to protect, only using old criteria in a new scenario. The most interesting thing is to realize that this mechanism doesn't clearly distinguish between physical and symbolic danger. Social rejection, professional failure, loss of status, criticism, uncertainty about the future. All of these activate circuits similar to those of threat. The brain reacts as if something essential were at risk. And, to react quickly, it creates connections. It closes circuits. It constructs explanations. This dynamic explains why certain beliefs are so difficult to dismantle. They are not just ideas. They are internalized survival responses. Questioning them generates discomfort because it puts the brain back in front of a void, uncertainty, and a feeling of unpreparedness. That is why, often, it is easier to maintain a wrong explanation than to face the unknown. Throughout life, this system becomes more sophisticated. It learns from strong emotions, reinforces patterns that seem to have worked in the past, and ignores nuances. The brain doesn't like to reevaluate everything from scratch. It prefers to reuse existing connections. This saves energy and speeds up decisions. But it also crystallizes interpretations. This is a central point in the journey of personal transformation. Realizing that not all certainty comes from logic, that many convictions are born from a need for security, not from careful analysis, and that the emotional impact of an experience does not guarantee that the interpretation made about it is true. When you understand that the brain prefers to be wrong than to be unprepared, you begin to look at your own thoughts with more curiosity and less judgment. Instead of asking, "Why do I think this way?" a deeper question arises, "What is my brain trying to protect me from right now?" This shift in perspective opens the door to important revelations. It's not about shutting down instincts, nor about denying emotions. It's about recognizing their origin. About perceiving when a reaction comes from an old mechanism operating in a new context. Noticing when a decision is being guided more by fear of the unknown than by a real assessment of the situation. This recognition doesn't happen all at once. It emerges gradually as you observe recurring patterns in your own experience. Exaggerated reactions. Overly hasty certainties. Internal stories that repeat themselves. All of this begins to take on another layer of meaning when you understand the survival logic behind them. And the more this understanding deepens, the clearer it becomes that these non-existent connections are not isolated flaws, but part of a much larger system that influences memory, identity, and perception of reality. From here, the focus naturally shifts to how this same mechanism operates in even more sensitive areas of the mind, shaping not only immediate reactions, but also how you construct your own story. If this part of the reflection resonated with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because up to this point we've talked about mechanisms, evolutionary origins, and survival before logic. But there's a part of this process that's rarely confronted head-on. A less comfortable part. It's when these non-existent connections cease to be mere curiosities of the mind and take silent control of your life. This is where the dark side appears. When the brain creates a false connection and it is repeated, it begins to solidify. It ceases to be just a momentary interpretation and becomes a belief. And beliefs are not just loose ideas. They function as lenses through which you see the world. Without realizing it, You begin to filter experiences, ignore contrary information, and reinforce everything that confirms the internal narrative that has already been created. This is how limiting beliefs are born. Not as conscious decisions but as automatic conclusions. I'm not good at this. It always goes wrong for me. This kind of thing doesn't work. At some point in the journey, the brain connected some isolated events, closed the circuit too quickly, and transformed that into personal truth. From then on, each new experience is interpreted in the light of this belief. The brain is not looking for new evidence. It is looking for confirmation. The most dangerous thing is that these beliefs seem to protect you. They prevent frustration, risk, exposure. If you believe something isn't for you, you don't try it. If you believe you always fail, you prepare to lose. If you believe you can't trust, you keep your distance. All of this creates a feeling of immediate security. But the cost is high. The cost is a life guided by invisible limits. The same thing happens with fears without a real origin. Fears that arise without a clear event, without a specific trauma, without a concrete threat. The brain at some point associated a sensation with a risk. Perhaps an old experience, perhaps a casual observation, perhaps a story heard. It doesn't matter. The connection was made. And once made, the body reacts as if the danger were present now. These fears are difficult to question because they don't come with a logical explanation. They come as a sensation. Tightness in the chest. Tension in the body. A desire to avoid. And the brain interprets this physical reaction as proof that something is wrong. The circuit reinforces itself. Fear generates avoidance. Avoidance prevents new experiences. The absence of new experiences prevents the correction of the belief. The cycle closes. When you begin to realize this, you understand that many decisions are not made based on current reality, but on internal illusions. Decisions based on old stories, unverified patterns, associations that have never been reviewed. You think you are choosing freely, but in reality you are only obeying connections created in the past to deal with the unknown. This is the most profound impact of these false connections. They reduce your range of choices. They transform possibilities into threats. They transform uncertainty into danger. They transform silence into a negative signal. The mind begins to react even before you realize there were alternatives. Behind the scenes, the brain believes it's doing the right thing. It feels it's protecting you from pain, rejection, failure, loss. But it doesn't clearly distinguish between real pain and emotional discomfort, between concrete risk and imagined risk, between present threat and old memory. All of this enters the same alert system. This is where the fear trigger kicks in hard. Because realizing that your decisions might be guided by internal illusions is uncomfortable. It gives a strange feeling of loss of control. But at the same time, this realization is liberating. Because what was learned automatically can also be consciously revised. Awareness doesn't eliminate fear immediately. It doesn't dissolve limiting beliefs overnight. But it creates a crack in the system. A space where you begin to notice when a reaction doesn't match the true size of the situation. When certainty arises too quickly. When an internal narrative seems too close to be true. This space is fundamental for any real transformation. Not a superficial motivational transformation, but a profound change of mindset. A change that begins with the simple ability to observe one's own thoughts without becoming completely confused by them. When you realize that a decision is being made based on a non-existent connection, something changes. Even if you still feel fear, still feel insecurity, still feel resistance. The difference is that now you know it's a process, not a final sentence. And that gives you back power. Little by little, you begin to notice how many areas of your life have been shaped by these false connections. Relationships avoided. Paths not followed. Dreams abandoned too soon. All this not because it was impossible, but because the brain created a convincing story to avoid dealing with the unknown. This is the true impact of these connections. They don't just distort your perception of the world. They shape your identity. They define who you believe you are, what you believe you are capable of, how far you believe you can go. And the longer they go unquestioned, the more natural they seem. But when that awareness begins to expand, something interesting happens. You no longer try to eliminate all connections. You start choosing which ones deserve to be taken seriously. Which ones are useful. Which ones are just echoes of an old system trying to protect you from something that no longer poses a real threat. It is from this point that the journey deepens even further. Because when you understand the dark side of these connections, the most powerful question of all naturally arises. What happens when you learn to observe these patterns in real time while they are being formed? It is precisely in this territory that the conversation begins to enter now. If this passage really made you think, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a silent tipping point that completely changes how you relate to your own mind. It's not a trick. It's not a miracle method. And it's definitely not about switching off the brain or fighting against it. The big turning point happens when you realize something simple, yet profound. Questioning the connections that the brain creates already changes everything. Up to this point, it might seem that the brain is almost an internal enemy, a saboteur that creates illusions, fears, and limitations. But that interpretation would also be a hasty connection. The brain doesn't need to be fought. It needs to be understood. It continues to do exactly what it was designed to do: create quick meaning, reduce uncertainty, protect you from the unknown. The problem isn't the mechanism itself. The problem is living on autopilot without ever looking behind the scenes. When you begin to perceive how a connection is born, something transforms in your internal experience. It's not that thoughts stop arising. They continue to come. Associations continue to happen. The difference is that now there is a small space between the thought and its adherence. An almost imperceptible interval where you observe instead of just reacting. This space changes your mindset. Because in that interval you begin to notice recurring patterns. The same stories repeating themselves. The same quick conclusions. The same emotions triggered by similar stimuli. You start to notice that certain interpretations arise whenever you feel threatened, insecure, or out of control. And you realize that it's not the world that's repeating itself in exactly the same way, it's the brain that's reusing old connections. This moment of realization is not comfortable. It shakes the ground from under some certainties. It makes you question narratives that seem solid. But at the same time it gives back something essential: inner freedom. Because what is seen ceases to operate completely in the dark. What is observed begins to lose its automatic power. The big turning point happens when you understand that you don't need to eliminate negative thoughts, limiting beliefs, or fears immediately. You just need to recognize them as constructs, hypotheses, internal stories that the brain created to make sense of something at some point in your journey. When you do this, these stories cease to be orders and become information. This changes the way you make decisions. Instead of acting immediately based on internal certainty, you start asking yourself, is this a fact or is it a connection my brain is creating right now? This simple question already alters the emotional impact of the situation. It slows down the impulse. It opens up space for a more conscious choice. This process doesn't transform you into someone cold or overly rational. On the contrary, it deepens your relationship with your own experience. You begin to feel emotions without being completely swept away by them. You begin to hear thoughts without becoming totally fused with their content. This is a more sophisticated level of awareness, and it arises from observation, not control. When you start observing your own mental patterns, you discover interesting things. You discover which situations make the brain close the circuit faster. You discover which themes activate more fear, which activate more need for control, which awaken old stories. These revelations don't all appear at once. They emerge gradually in seemingly ordinary moments. Perhaps you realize that you always interpret silence as rejection. Or that you tend to associate mistakes with definitive failure. Or that small negative signs take on enormous weight within you. None of this defines who you are. It only shows how your brain has learned to operate so far. And what has been learned can be revisited. This is a crucial point in personal transformation. It's not about replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. That would simply be swapping one narrative for another. It's about changing your relationship with the narratives themselves. It's about realizing that you are not obligated to believe everything your brain presents as truth. When this change happens, external reality doesn't change immediately. The challenges remain. The uncertainties remain. But the way you navigate this reality changes. The journey ceases to be guided solely by automatic reactions and begins to include choice, reflection, and presence. The hidden truth here is that awareness is already a form of intervention. It's not necessary to fix everything now. It's not necessary to resolve all beliefs at once. The simple act of observing already weakens the hold of false connections. Because that which depends on the automatic loses power when it encounters awareness. And the more you practice this attentive observation, the sooner you notice when a connection is forming. You begin to notice the exact moment when the brain tries to close the story too quickly. That instant is precious. It's there that something new can happen. Not a ready-made answer, but an opening. It is in this area that the conversation naturally begins to delve even deeper, because observing patterns is only the beginning. From here, an inevitable question arises. What happens when you learn to hold onto the void for a little longer, without immediately filling it with an explanation? It is in this space that new possibilities begin to emerge. If this thought resonated with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything said so far begins to converge on a realization that may be uncomfortable at first glance, but profoundly transformative when truly assimilated. After understanding how the brain creates non-existent connections, why it does this, how these patterns close and begin to control us, an inevitable perception emerges. You don't see reality as it is, you see reality as your brain has learned to construct it. This isn't a pretty metaphor. It's a psychological fact. The brain doesn't deliver the raw, direct, objective world. It delivers an edited, organized, filtered, and narrated version of experience. A version that makes sense within the story it's been telling itself for years. This story involves who you believe you are, what you believe you deserve, what you believe is dangerous, possible, or impossible. All of this operates behind the scenes, silently, while you live with the feeling of simply observing life. The big revelation here is realizing that what you call reality is, to a large extent, an internal construct. A continuous interpretation. A permanent adjustment between external stimuli and internal mental maps. The brain doesn't ask, what is real? It asks, what does this mean to me? And that question changes everything. When two people experience the same situation and come away with completely different conclusions, it's not because reality has changed. It's because each brain has constructed a distinct narrative to feel safe within that experience. One interprets it as a threat, another as a challenge. One sees rejection, another sees neutrality. One feels failure, another feels learning. The event is the same. The construction is different. This construction doesn't happen by chance. It's guided by past experiences, significant emotions, repeated patterns, and reorganized memories. The brain takes all of this and assembles a version of the world that seems predictable enough to allow movement. Because chaos paralyzes. Excessive uncertainty generates anxiety. And the brain will do almost anything to avoid this state. That's why he invents stories. Some useful. Others limiting. Some bring you closer to life. Others push you away. But they all have the same basic function. Reduce fear, the fear of the unknown, of emptiness, of lack of control. The brain constructs reality as one builds a shelter. When you begin to see this clearly, something profound happens. You realize that many of the truths that governed your decisions may never have been universal truths. They were internal solutions, adaptation strategies, learned responses. This doesn't invalidate your experience. On the contrary, it honors the brain's effort in keeping you functioning, even in difficult contexts. But at the same time, this perception opens up space for a new relationship with one's own mind. A less naive, less automatic relationship. You begin to understand that thoughts are not facts. That certainties may be merely mental habits. That deep convictions may have been born from connections created in moments of vulnerability, not from solid evidence. This understanding doesn't take away the ground beneath your feet. It broadens the scope. It doesn't eliminate the need for meaning, but it brings awareness of how that meaning is produced. And that changes the quality of the journey. Because when you know you are constructing reality, you can begin to choose as build. It's not about denying difficulties, feigning positivity, or creating convenient illusions. It's about recognizing when a narrative is being used merely to maintain a sense of security that is no longer needed. Many internal stories were useful in the past, but today they only limit us. They keep running because they were never questioned, not because they still make sense. The impact of this perception spreads to everything. To the way you relate to others. To the way you interpret silence, mistakes, success, rejection. To the decisions you avoid making and the opportunities you let pass. You begin to notice how many times you confused a feeling of certainty with truth. How many times you took comfort as proof. And perhaps this is where the most unsettling thought takes hold. If the reality you see is, to a large extent, constructed, then changing the way you look at it changes the very experience of living. Not magically but consistently, gradually, profoundly. The transformation begins at the exact point where you stop confusing the construct with the world itself. This awareness doesn't make you lose your sense of reality. It gives you perspective. It makes you realize that there's always more than one possible interpretation. More than one narrative available. More than one path beyond the one your brain has presented as the only one. That's why the real mystery of the brain isn't in strange thoughts, cognitive lapses, or fleeting illusions. It's in that impressive ability to invent internal worlds so you can keep going. Worlds that seem so real they're rarely questioned. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the brain is not what it sees, but what does he invent to feel safe? And when that thought begins to resonate, something shifts inside. Because, from that point on, it's no longer possible to look at one's own mind in the same way. The gaze becomes more attentive, more curious, more conscious. And it is precisely at this point that new questions arise, new possibilities, and new ways of perceiving what previously seemed too obvious to question. If this thought has been resonating with you, comment below, "That makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation has resonated with you in some way. It wasn't just curiosity, it was identification, reflection, perhaps even a pleasant little discomfort. And that's exactly why this channel exists. To provoke this kind of internal pause, this closer look at the mind and everything that happens behind the scenes of thought. If it makes sense for you to continue exploring these topics, subscribe to the channel. That way, whenever a new video comes out along these lines, mysteries of the mind, brain, perception, and those truths we almost never question, you can follow me on this journey. If you want to leave a note that you've read to the end, write it in the comments below. "This message was for me." I do read, and that also helps me understand how this content is impacting those on the other side of the screen. And if at any point you thought this resonated with me, leave a like. It's a simple gesture, but it signals that this type of conversation is worth continuing. There's a video over there that perfectly complements this topic. It delves even deeper into the relationship between the brain, perception, and reality. Click there and continue watching.